poverty is a state of deprivation, lacking the usual or socially acceptable amount of money and material possessions. The most common measure of poverty in the U.S. is the poverty threshold set by the U.S. government. This measure recognizes poverty as a lack of those goods and services commonly taken for granted by members of mainstream society. The official threshold is adjusted for inflation using the Consumer Price Index. Most Americans will spend at least 1 year below the poverty line at some point between ages 25 and 75. Poverty rates are persistently higher in rural and inner-city parts of the country as compared to suburban areas. In 2009, 13.2% Americans lived in poverty. Starting in the 1930s, relative poverty rates have consistently exceeded those of other wealthy nations. California has a poverty rate of 23.8%, the highest of any state in the country. This is updated from the November 2012 estimate of 23.6. In 2009, the number of people who were in poverty was approaching 1960s levels that led to the National War on Poverty. In 2011, extreme poverty in the United States, meaning households living on less than $2 per day before government benefits, was double 1996 levels at 1.5 million households, including 2.8 million children. In 2012, the percentage of seniors living in poverty was 14%, while 18% of children were. The addition of Social Security benefits contributed more to reduce poverty than any other factor. Recent census data shows that half the population qualifies as poor or low income, with 1 in 5 millennials living in poverty. Academic contributors to the Routledge Handbook of Poverty in the United States postulate that new and extreme forms of poverty have emerged in the U.S. as a result of neoliberal structural adjustment policies and globalization, which have rendered economically marginalized communities as destitute, surplus populations in need of control and punishment. In 2011, child poverty reached record high levels, with 16.7 million children living in food-insecure households, about 35% more than 2007 levels. A 2013 UNICEF report ranked the U.S. as having the second highest relative child poverty rates in the developed world. There were about 643,000 sheltered and unsheltered homeless people nationwide in January 2009. Almost two-thirds stayed in an emergency shelter or transitional housing program, and the other third were living on the street, in an abandoned building, or another place not meant for human habitation. About 1.56 million people, or about 0.5% of the U.S. population, used an emergency shelter or a transitional housing program between October 1, 2008 and September 30, 2009. Around 44% of homeless people are employed. In June 2016, the IMF warned the United States that its high poverty rate needs to be tackled urgently by raising the minimum wage and offering paid maternity leave to women to encourage them to enter the labor force. Measures of poverty. Two are official measures of poverty. There are two basic versions of the federal poverty measure: the poverty thresholds and the poverty guidelines. The Census Bureau issues the poverty thresholds, which are generally used for statistical purposes, for example, to estimate the number of people in poverty nationwide each year and classify them by type of residence, race, and other social, economic, and demographic characteristics. The Department of Health and Human Services issues the poverty guidelines for administrative purposes, for instance, to determine whether a person or family is eligible for assistance through various federal programs. The Orshansky poverty thresholds formed the basis for the current measure of poverty in the U.S. Molly Orshansky was an economist working for the Social Security Administration. Her work appeared at an opportune moment. Orshansky's article was published later in the same year that Johnson declared war on poverty. Since her measure was absolute, it made it possible to objectively answer whether the U.S. government was winning this war. The newly formed United States Office of Economic Opportunity adopted the lower of the Orshansky poverty thresholds for statistical, planning, and budgetary purposes in May 1965. The Bureau of the Budget adopted Orshansky's definition for statistical use in all executive departments. The measure gave a range of income cutoffs, or thresholds, adjusted for factors such as family size, sex of the family head, number of children under 18 years old, and farm and non-farm residents. The Economy Food Plan was at the core of this definition of poverty. At the time of creating the poverty definition, the Department of Agriculture found that families of 3 or more persons spent about one-third of their after-tax income on food. For these families, poverty thresholds were set at 3 times the cost of the Economy Food Plan. Different procedures were used for calculating poverty thresholds for 2-person households and persons living alone. Annual updates of the SSA poverty thresholds were based on price changes in the Economy Food Plan, but updates do not reflect other changes. 2 changes were made to the poverty definition in 1969. Thresholds for non-farm families were tied to annual changes in the Consumer Price Index, rather than changes in the cost of the Economy Food Plan. Farm thresholds were raised from 70 to 85% of the non-farm levels. In 1981, further changes were made to the poverty definition. Separate thresholds for farm and female householder families were eliminated. The largest family size category became 9 persons or more. Apart from these changes, the U.S. government's approach to measuring poverty has remained static for the past 40 years. Recent poverty rate and guidelines. The poverty guideline figures are not the figures the Census Bureau uses to calculate the number of poor persons. The figures that the Census Bureau uses of the poverty thresholds. The Census Bureau provides an explanation of the difference between poverty thresholds and guidelines. The Census Bureau uses a set of money-income thresholds that vary by family size and composition to determine who is in poverty. The 2010 figure for a family of 4 with no children under 18 years of age is $22,541, while the figure for a family of 4 with 2 children under 18 is $22,162. For comparison, the 2011 HHS poverty guideline for a family of 4 is $22,350. Numbers in other countries. Comparing poverty levels among countries is difficult, because a variety of factors are at play. The official number of poor in the United States in 2008 is about 39.1 million people, greater in number but not percentage than the officially poor in Indonesia, which has a far lower Human Development Index and the next largest population after the United States. While the percentages appear the same, the actual income is not the same among both groups of people living below the nation's poverty levels. Understanding the many aspects not of using but of comparing poverty definitions can aid perception. The Human Poverty Index, or Human Development Index, may help global comparison in quality of living, but comparisons must be adjusted for differences within countries. Relative measures of poverty. Another way of looking at poverty is in relative terms. Relative poverty can be defined as having significantly less income and wealth than other members of society. Therefore, the relative poverty rate is a measure of income inequality. When the standard of living among those in more financially advantageous positions rises while that of those considered poor stagnates, the relative poverty rate will reflect such growing income inequality and increase. Conversely, the relative poverty rate can decrease, with low-income people coming to have less wealth and income if wealthier people's wealth is reduced by a larger percentage than theirs. In 1959, a family at the poverty line had an income that was 42.64% of the median income. If the poverty line in 1999 was less than 42.64% of the median income, then relative poverty would have increased. Some critics argue that relying on income disparity to determine who is impoverished can be misleading. The Bureau of Labor Statistics data suggests that consumer spending varies much less than income. In 2008, the poorest one-fifth of Americans' households spent on average $12,955 per person for goods and services. The second quintile spent $14,168, the third $16,255, the fourth $19,695, while the richest fifth spent $26,644. The disparity of expenditures is much less than the disparity of income. Income distribution and relative poverty. Although the relative approach theoretically differs largely from the Orshansky definition, crucial variables of both poverty definitions are more similar than often thought. First, the so-called standardization of income in both approaches is very similar. To make incomes comparable among households of different sizes, equivalent scales are used to standardize household income to the level of a single-person household. When compared to the U.S. Census poverty line, which is based on a defined basket of goods, for the most prevalent household types, both standardization methods show very similar results. Poverty and demographics. In addition to family status, race, ethnicity and age also correlate with high poverty rates in the United States. Although data regarding race and poverty are more extensively published and cross-tabulated, the family status correlation is by far the strongest. Poverty and family status. According to the U.S. Census, in 2007, 5.8% of all people in married families lived in poverty, as did 26.6% of all persons in single-parent households and 19.1% of all persons living alone. More than 75% of all poor households are headed by women. By race, ethnicity, and family status. Based on data from 2007 among married couple families, 5.8% lived in poverty. This number varied by race and ethnicity as follows: 5.4% of all white persons, 10.7% of all black persons, and 14.9% of all Hispanic persons living in poverty. Among single-parent families, 26.6% lived in poverty. This number varied by race and ethnicity as follows: 22.5% of all white persons, 44.0% of all black persons, and 33.4% of all Hispanic persons living in poverty. Among individuals living alone, 19.1% lived in poverty. This number varied by race and ethnicity as follows: 18% of white persons, 28.9% of black persons, and 27% of Hispanic persons living in poverty. Poverty and race ethnicity. The U.S. Census declared that in 2014, 14.8% of the general population lived in poverty. 48.1% of all white non-Hispanic persons, 1.0% of all Asian persons, 2.6% of all Hispanic persons, 76.2% of all African American persons, 3.9% of Native Americans living on reservations, and 2.4% of all Native Americans on and off reservations. About half of those living in poverty are non-Hispanic white, but poverty rate so much higher for Native Americans, for African Americans, and for Hispanics. Non-Hispanic white children comprised 57% of all poor rural children. In FY 1978, African American families comprised 33.3% of TANF families. Non-Hispanic white families comprised 31.2%, and 28.8% were Hispanic. Poverty among Native Americans. Poverty is also notoriously high on Native American reservations. 7 of the 11 poorest counties in per capita income, including the 2 poorest in the U.S., encompass Lakota Sioux reservations in South Dakota. This fact has been cited by some critics as a mechanism that enables the kidnapping of Lakota children by the state of South Dakota's Department of Social Services. The Lakota People's Law Project, among other critics, allege that South Dakota inappropriately equates economic poverty with neglect. South Dakota's rate of identifying neglect is 18% higher than the national average. In 2010, the national average of state discernment of neglect, as a percent of total maltreatment of foster children prior to their being taken into custody by the state, was 78.3%. In South Dakota the rate was 95.8%. Poverty in the Pine Ridge Reservation in particular has had unprecedented effects on its residents' longevity. Recent reports state the average life expectancy is 45 years old, while others state that it is 48 years old for men and 52 years old for women. With either set of figures, that's the shortest life expectancy for any community in the Western Hemisphere outside Haiti. According to the Wall Street Journal, Poverty and Age. The U.S. Census declared that in 2010, 15.1% of the general population lived in poverty. 13.7% of all people 19 to 21 and 9% of all people ages 65 and older. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development uses a different measure for poverty and declared in 2008 that child poverty in the U.S. is 20% and poverty among the elderly is 23%. The non-profit advocacy group Feeding America has released a study based on 2005 to 2007 data from the U.S. Census Bureau and the Agriculture Department, which claims that 3.5 million children under the age of 5 are at risk of hunger in the United States. The study claims that in 11 states, Louisiana, which has the highest rate, followed by North Carolina, Ohio, Kentucky, Texas, New Mexico, Kansas, South Carolina, Tennessee, Idaho and Arkansas, more than 20% of children under 5 are allegedly at risk of going hungry. The study was paid by Conagra Foods, a large food company. Child poverty in 2012, 16.1 million American children were living in poverty. Outside of the 49 million Americans living in food-insecure homes, 15.9 million of them were children. In 2013, child poverty reached record high levels in the U.S., with 16.7 million children living in food-insecure households. Many of the neighborhoods these children live in lack basic produce and nutritious food. 47 million Americans depend on food banks, more than 30% above 2007 levels. Households headed by single mothers are most likely to be affected. 30% of low-income single mothers cannot afford diapers. Inability to afford this necessity can cause a chain reaction, including mental health and behavioral problems. Some women are forced to make use of one or two diapers, using them more than once. This causes rashes and sanitation problems as well as health problems. Without diapers, children are unable to enter into daycare. The lack of childcare can be detrimental to single mothers, hindering their ability to obtain employment. Worst affected are Oregon, Arizona, New Mexico, Florida, and the District of Columbia, while North Dakota, New Hampshire, Virginia, Minnesota, and Massachusetts are the least affected. 31 million low-income children received free or reduced-price meals daily through the National School Lunch Program during the 2012 federal fiscal year. Nearly 14 million children are estimated to be served by Feeding America, with over 3 million being of the ages of 5 and under. A 2014 report by the National Center on Family Homelessness states the number of homeless children in the U.S. has reached record levels, calculating that 2.5 million children, or one child in every 30, experienced homelessness in 2013. High levels of poverty, lack of affordable housing, and domestic violence were cited as the primary causes. Poverty and education. Poverty affects individual access to quality education. The U.S. education system is funded by local communities, therefore the quality of materials and teachers reflects the affluence of community. Low-income communities are not able to afford the quality education that high-income communities do. Another important aspect of education in low-income communities is the apathy of both students and teachers. To some, the children of the poor or ignorant are mere copies of the parents fated to live at the same level of income and education as the parents. The effect of such a perception can manifest itself in teachers who will not put forth the effort to teach and students who are opposed to learning. In both cases, poor students are thought to be incapable. Females in poverty are also likely to become pregnant at a young age, and with fewer resources to care for a child. Young women often drop out of school. Due to these and other reasons, the quality of education between the classes is not equal. Food security. 89% of the American households were food secure throughout the entire year of 2002, meaning that they had access at all times to enough food for an active, healthy life for all of the household members. The remaining households were food insecure at least some time during that year. The prevalence of food insecurity rose from 10.7% in 2001 to 11.1% in 2002, and the prevalence of food insecurity with hunger rose from 3.3% to 3.5%. In 2007, 88.9% of American households were food secure throughout the entire year. The number of American households that were food secure throughout the entire year dropped to 85.4% in 2008. As of 2012, the prevalence of food insecurity has been essentially unchanged since 2008. Factors in poverty. There are numerous factors related to poverty in the United States. According to the American Enterprise Institute, research has shown that income and intelligence are related. In a 1998 study, Charles Murray compared the earnings of 733 full sibling pairs with differing intelligence quotients. He referred to the sample as utopian in that the sampled pairs were raised in families with virtually no illegitimacy, divorce or poverty. The average earnings of sampled individuals with an IQ of under 75 was $11,000, compared to $16,000 for those with an IQ between 75 and 90. $23,000 for those with an IQ between 90 and 110, $27,000 for those with an IQ between 110 and 125, and $38,000 for those with an IQ above 125. Murray's work on IQ has been criticized by Stephen Jay Gould, Louis Quant, and others. Income has a high correlation with educational levels. In 2007, the median earnings of households headed by individuals with less than a ninth-grade education was $20,805, while households headed by high school graduates earned $40,456. Households headed by holders of bachelor's degrees earned $77,605, and families headed by individuals with professional degrees earned $100,000. In many cases, poverty is caused by job loss. In 2007, the poverty rate was 21.5% for individuals who were unemployed, but only 2.5% for individuals who were employed full-time. In 1991, 8.3% of children in two-parent families were likely to live in poverty. 19.6% of children lived with a father in a single-parent family, and 47.1% in a single-parent family headed by a mother. Income levels vary with age. For example, the median 2009 income for households headed by individuals age 15 to 24 was only $30,750, but increased to $50,188 for households headed by individuals age 25 to 34 and $61,083 for households headed by individuals 35 to 44. Work experience and additional education may be factors. Income levels vary along racial ethnic lines. 21% of all children in the United States live in poverty, about 46% of black children and 40% of Latino children. The poverty rate is 9.9% for black married couples, and only 30% of black children are born to married couples. The poverty rate for native-born and naturalized whites is identical. On the other hand, the poverty rate for naturalized blacks is 11.8% compared to 25.1% for native-born blacks, suggesting race alone does not explain income disparity. Not all minorities have low incomes. Asian families have higher incomes than all other ethnic groups. For example, the 2005 median income of Asian families was $68,957 compared to the median income of white families of $59,124. Asians, however, report discrimination occurrences more frequently than blacks. Specifically, 31% of Asians reported employment discrimination compared to 26% of blacks in 2005. The relationship between tax rates and poverty is disputed. A study comparing high-tax Scandinavian countries with the U.S. suggests high tax rates are inversely correlated with poverty rates. The poverty rate, however, is low in some low-tax countries like Switzerland. A comparison of poverty rates between states reveals that some low-tax states have low poverty rates. For example, New Hampshire has the lowest poverty rate of any state in the U.S., and has very low taxes. It is true, however, that both Switzerland and New Hampshire have a very high household income and other measures offsetting the lack of taxation. For example, Switzerland has universal health care and a free system of education for children as young as 4 years old. New Hampshire has no state income tax or sales tax, but does have the nation's highest property taxes. The Heritage Foundation speculates that illegal immigration increases job competition among low-wage earners, both native and foreign-born. Additionally, many first-generation immigrants, namely those without a high school diploma, are also living in poverty themselves. Economist Jared Bernstein and Elise Gould of the Economic Policy Institute suggest that poverty could have decreased significantly if inequality had not increased over the last few decades. The poor in the United States are incarcerated at a much higher rate than their counterparts in other developed nations, with penal confinement being, according to sociologist Bruce Weston, commonplace for poor men of working age. A 2015 study by the Vera Institute of Justice contends that jails in the U.S. have become massive warehouses of the impoverished since the 1980s. Writing in the Rutledge Handbook of Poverty in the United States, the scholars Reuben Jonathan Miller and Emily Shaman state that the shift to neoliberal policies has more deeply embedded the carceral state within the lives of the poor, transforming what it means to be poor in America.